Hey guys, welcome to my channel. For today's video, I'm going to be explaining the difference between acrylic and wool. So I think these two fibers commonly do get confused at this point because technology in acrylic has advanced so much that you can now make acrylic to be even softer than some types of wool. So I'm just going to break it down pretty easily and just explain sort of the differences between the two. I'm going to try to keep this video as brief as I possibly can, but I will list the book I often reference down below. Don't buy it. It's just the book I use. It's literally like an encyclopedia of fabric and is not necessary for the majority of people. And I also will reference any articles or anything like that that I find that is helpful information in case you want to read any more about it than what I am giving you. In order to get this through as quickly as possible, I'm going to skip my intro. So if you like this stuff, subscribe. Let's go ahead and get into it. Hey guys, editing Emily here. I just filmed the video and I'm not refilming it. So just real quickly wanted to say I forgot to give my disclaimer, which is that all of the information I am giving you is based off of my knowledge as someone who went to school for fashion design and researches textiles by themselves for fun. So just wanted to give that brief disclaimer. Go ahead and watch the video now. So I'm going to start this off very similar to my silk versus satin video and just tell you the fundamental difference between these two, which is basically that acrylic is a synthetic fiber. Something that is a synthetic fiber is something that is made in a lab, usually with chemicals, and those chemicals are processed and pushed together in a certain way to create a type of fabric and a type of thread or yarn. Whereas wool is a natural fiber. Obviously, it most commonly comes from sheep. They also can get wool from camel and from Angora rabbits and also from alpacas. And I'm sure there's more, but those are sort of like the main types. I'm mostly going to be focusing on sheep's wool for this and not so much the other types of wool. If you are more curious about those types, like I said, I will try to link some information down below. And if you would like a video on those specific types of wool, you can let me know. But we're going to focus on acrylic first. So like I said, acrylic is a synthetic fiber, meaning it's made from chemicals. Acrylic is something, generally speaking, that can be machine washed. There are certain types of items made from acrylic, most commonly sweaters, that are labeled as dry clean only. I typically say if it is made from acrylic, it probably doesn't need dry cleaned. Now, that said, the care instructions on your item is the safest way to wash your item, so don't blame me if you mess up your sweater because you washed it. I'm just saying, generally speaking, you don't need to get synthetic fibers dry cleaned. You can wash them the majority of the time because they're made from chemicals. They normally don't need to be dry cleaned. Now, I wouldn't put acrylic by any means in the dryer, but the washer, you can usually get away with it. If anything, you could put it in a delicates bag. But like I said, the reason they put care instructions on there is that it's the safest way to clean that item, which basically means it is the least likely way you are going to F up cleaning your item, and so you can't blame them. So that's often why a lot of those items are labeled as dry clean only. Anyways, acrylic often gets a bad reputation because it used to be like a really scratchy, really unpleasant type of fabric to wear, and acrylic still can be scratchy, so can wool. But acrylic can still be more scratchy and can kind of like be a little tough on your skin, and people don't always like to wear sweaters that are like that without wearing like an undershirt because they're too itchy. Some people have more of like a sensitivity to it, other people don't. So it really depends on what you fall into with that. Now, acrylic really isn't as like scratchy per se as it once was. In fact, like I sort of said in the beginning, acrylic has gotten to a point where it is actually softer than some types of wool. They can make acrylic to be extremely soft because the technology has advanced so much at this point, and because we're making the fiber in a lab, they can kind of do with it what they want, especially if they have the money. So acrylic has definitely gotten a lot softer. A lot of like mossy fabric is sort of like the description of it. Acrylic's also way easier to make into like multiple colors. So like if you want to dye it different colors and you want to make like a multicolored sweater, it's way easier to do that with acrylic because it's much easier to get that fiber like almost stark white as compared to wool, which is a natural fiber. It's naturally going to have some type of color to it unless you bleach it. Like I said, this is an acrylic sweater right here. This is actually a combination of acrylic and cotton. Sometimes they will mix acrylic and cotton together to make a sweater or a cardigan a little bit softer because cotton is not quite as scratchy or quite as bulky as acrylic. Also, sometimes they'll mix polyester polyester with it because polyester is something that's easier to make into a thinner, nicer fiber than acrylic. The composition of acrylic, which I'm not going to get into because that's a little bit past my knowledge, the technicalness of how acrylic is made, but basically acrylic, the chemical compound of it, it's not quite as easy to make into as many things as polyester is. So sometimes they'll also mix polyester in there. There's also a lot of sweaters now that are thinner that are just made 100% of polyester. So like I said, this is an acrylic sweater, and honestly the feel of it, you wouldn't necessarily think it was acrylic unless you knew for sure that it was acrylic, because it doesn't feel like scratchy or anything like that. It's actually quite smooth, quite nice of a feel, quite nice of a texture, no real issue with it. And again, I think that's in part because it is mixed with cotton. I believe this is a 60-40, so 60% acrylic, 40% cotton. So that really is what helps to kind of make it a little bit softer. But generally speaking, 100% acrylic items can be very soft. And like I said, they're even softer than some types of wool. Acrylic's also much easier to control because it is a synthetic fiber. It's a lot easier to control, a lot easier to make. You can make it a lot more thin. You can make it into more finer fabrics or finer items. The main reason why acrylic is so much easier to work with, because it's a synthetic fiber. Acrylic typically isn't very expensive because it's not super expensive to make, and it's basically a cheap version of wool. So now I'm gonna get into wool, and wool is what is going to definitely take up the majority of this video. So unlike acrylic, when it comes to wool, wool has a very large price discrepancy. Acrylic, you're looking at more affordable prices across the board. Sometimes there will be acrylic mixed in with things. Cotton can be mixed into sweaters, polyester. Sometimes they even mix silk into sweaters. So you can mix a lot of different fibers into sweaters that can make it more expensive, but you're not really gonna have 100% acrylic sweater being expensive. Wool, on the other hand, very much ranges in price. And the reason for that is because there's so many different types of wool. So like I mentioned, there is wool that comes from different animals that I'm not really going to get into in this because this video would be forever long. So I'm just going to cover the sheep's wool. And there are different types of sheep, which is why there is also such a price discrepancy in wool as well, because certain sheep only live in certain areas. It will depend as well on the difficulty it is to comb the fibers of wool. Combing is basically like thinning out the fibers so that you can turn it into yarn. So depending on what kind of wool you're working with will depend on how long that is going to take you. And it also depends where the wool is sourced. Sourcing plays a huge role into cost. Of course, brand also plays a role, but at the end of the day, I would say what plays usually the biggest role is your sourcing, your manufacturing, and really just your supply chain in general, and the quality that you're putting forward. When it comes to wool, that is one of the biggest reasons for price discrepancies. So you have like lamb's wool, which is going to be a certain amount. You have merino wool, which is a very luxurious fine wool. You have cashmere. So first I want to talk about merino wool because I think merino wool is very intriguing. So merino wool comes from a merino sheep, which is a very specific type of sheep. This sheep has very soft wool. The wool is coveted by a lot of people, and these sheep are not exactly very common. I believe they originate somewhere in Europe. I want to say Spain. I think it's Spain. If I'm wrong, I'll correct it, but I'm pretty sure it's Spain. But most of where merino wool comes from today is actually in Australia. And that's pretty much where you're gonna get any merino wool. So anything that's made from merino wool is automatically going to cost you a lot more than anything made from more common types of wool. A standard sheep wool is not gonna cost you as much. It's probably gonna be under $100, maybe in like the 60 to 70 range. Merino wool, you're going to be spending over $100. So the wool is very coveted because it's naturally very soft, it's naturally very long, which is a huge part in it. It's really hard to work with short, stubby fibers, wanting the longer fibers because it's going to be much easier to make into yarn, much easier to make into thread, much easier to make into the item that you want. So I have like a wool coat in front of me. Now wool also is knitted most of the time, so if it's knitted, you just want to get it into the yarn. But if you're making it into something that is more of like a true fabric, then you need to be able to get it to a point where it's fine enough that you're gonna be able to press it into that fabric, especially if you're going for a felt. As you can see, this is, like I said, 100% wool. This is fairly soft. It has a little bit of a scratchy texture. It's not something I would want straight up against my skin, but this is a coat. I don't have a wool sweater. fiber. Typically speaking, that wool is going to be a bit thicker anyways, and because of that, that's why this texture is a little bit on the more like scratchy or like itchy side, because it's not meant to be directly on your skin. Directly on your skin, you're looking at something a little bit softer. So this is obviously not going to be like merino wool. This is just going to be from like your normal everyday sheep. With regular like sheep, like your every average day sheep that you normally would think of, the wool in that can be very inconsistent. Certain sheep, sometimes maybe their fibers will be a little bit longer, so then they're easier to work with, kind of like the merino wool. But then you also have sheep that are gonna have these short stubby fibers. That is a lot harder to work with and a lot harder to get to a place where it's going to be able to really be worn on the body in a way that it's not going to bother or like scratch at you. Because wool is such like a time-consuming process, that's also often why it's so expensive. You have to comb physically through wool. And yes, they have machines for that now, but it's still a long process, especially if you're trying to get very thin fibers and you want something for like cashmere or like a nice, really soft type of fabric. It's going to take you a lot longer than it is to get something that's not quite as nice. This coat is a little bit more scratchy because they don't have to thin it out as much because it's gonna be outerwear. Another factor that can contribute to the cost of wool sometimes will even depend on like the country in which this is being sourced. Certain countries will charge you less than others depending on where you're sourcing the wool. Now that does come with usually, I would say, some type of ethical issues that I'm not gonna get into right now, but if you can guess, certain countries treat animals and people better than others. That's all I have to say about that, but that will also add into the cost of your wool. Some little known facts about wool is that wool, much like silk, is flame retardant. I believe I mentioned this in silk versus satin, but if you were to light wool on fire, it will self-extinguish. Acrylic, just like polyester, will melt. You see the common trend here. It's really interesting because, like I said, if you hold the wool to a flame, of course it's going to light on fire. The second you take it away, the fire's out. Wool is actually also better for the environment than acrylic, generally speaking. The reason for this is because wool, being a more natural fiber, isn't going to cause typically as much as an environmental impact as something like acrylic. Acrylic and polyester, while they are nice in theory in some ways, the amount of chemicals used to make those causes a lot of pollution in a sense of not only like air pollution, but also can cause water pollution as well, especially when they're in the process of dyeing those fabrics. One thing you do want to keep in mind with wool is you never, ever want to wash wool, and you want to avoid getting it wet at all costs, because wool, if you get it wet, it will lose its strength. It literally cuts the strength in half if you get it wet. So you never ever want to wash wool. Wool should always be dry cleaned. Silk, there are some exceptions like I mentioned in that video, but wool has to be dry cleaned. It cannot under any circumstance be washed. Acrylic is recommended sometimes for dry cleaning. Like I said, usually 90% of the time, I would say you can wash acrylic. There are always exceptions, so always follow the care instructions on your tag if you are unsure. But I have never ever dry cleaned anything that is acrylic, and I've never had an issue. But like I said, don't blame me if you have up your clothes. So if you're trying to decide like what's better, like a wool sweater versus an acrylic sweater, I would say you have a lot of different factors to consider. Wool is no matter what going to be more. No matter what, you're going to be spending at least probably $70 on a wool sweater. Acrylic, you might be spending like $40, $30 on a sweater. Of course, there's always the environmental issues with it. There's also the feel of it, because like I mentioned, wool is in general, I would say, softer because it's a more natural fiber, but it can be more scratchy. Normally, they try to formulate acrylic to be very soft now, whereas with wool, since it's a natural fiber, there's only so much you can do with it. The other thing too with wool that you always want to kind of keep in mind is certain wool sweaters that have like a texture to them are usually made from slub yarn. Slub yarn is basically a yarn that is inconsistently straight. So it's not straight. You'll have like bumps here, bumps there. Those slubs can sometimes cause more itching. That is also sometimes done on purpose because it does create a really cool texture and look, but other times it just happens on accident. Also keep in mind, acrylic, I would say 90% of the time you can wash it. You can't wash wool under any circumstance whatsoever. You can also get polyester sweaters, like I mentioned, if you're looking for certain sweaters. Polyester sweaters, though, are going to be very lightweight and very thin. Cotton is also often used in sweaters now. Those tend to be very, very comfortable to wear because cotton, generally speaking, is a nicer fiber to have on your body. I'm wearing a cotton t-shirt today. But like I was saying before, the fundamental difference really between these two is you kind of have wool over here that's going to be your natural fiber, and you have acrylic over here that's going to be your synthetic fiber. And both of those things come with completely different issues and completely different pros, so to speak. So I would definitely say look into what you think is the best, know what you're buying, and know the maintenance that you're going to have with either of these items. Like I said, they still recommend dry cleaning most 100% acrylic items. Dry cleaning may not necessarily be as big of a factor for you if you're going to dry clean either item anyways. All right, guys, so that was all for today's video. Again, I hope that this was informative and helpful. My goal is always to be helpful with these types of videos and kind of just give you the rundown on why these fabrics act the way they do, why these fibers are the way they are, just to be helpful so that you can be best informed and educated to make the best decision for you. That is all I have for you guys today. Like I said, I will link the resources down below in the description box in case you want to learn more about them or reference them at all. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up before you go, and don't forget to click that subscribe button. That is all for today, guys. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have a good one. Bye!